presentation that lasts around 20 minutes, followed by approximately 10 minutes discussion, but we're not going to stick too tightly to those times, questions, that is, for the speaker. And then we'll move into a discussion period where we discuss things more generally, not just about the presentation itself, but about our strategic priorities as a community, which are all flagged up on our website that we've shared with you in the email. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Corinna, who's presenting today. Corinna, you can share your slides when you're ready.
I will.
I'll give you a warning when there's a couple of minutes left if I need to, but I'm assuming you'll stick to that 20 minutes or thereabouts.
So, you see my slides?
Yeah, it looks good.
Good. Okay. Yeah, so thanks a lot for the invite to speak in the seminar series. It's nice to see some familiar faces and also some new faces. Looking forward to the discussion today. And I'm presenting today the work of Lena Frey, who was a postdoc in my group and has recently moved on to a new position. And therefore, I'm presenting on her behalf, but she was the one who did all the work and also prepared the slides. So I'll pass on any questions that I can't answer, and also all the compliments to her. So this work has been done within our collaborative research center, Waves to Weather, a large national project in Germany on the predictability of weather. And it's also very much on the weather scale, as you'll see, and contrary to some other PPE applications that you've discussed in previous seminars. And yeah, it's work together with other colleagues from KIT, Michael Kunz in particular, who is an expert on hail. And that's also how this idea of the focus of hail came into the project. And then with colleagues from the University of Mainz, Annette Miltenberger and Patrick Kunze, who worked with us on other parts of this project, and with colleagues from the University of Hamburg and the Compute Center in Hamburg, who provided methods for the clustering methods that we've applied here. And actually, not mentioned here, but I guess we should have mentioned it. This is also in collaboration with colleagues in Leeds, because Lena has been visiting Ken Carslow's group and also Jill Johnson, who's also here. I saw. Hi, Jill. And we've collaborated on the methods of statistical emulation. So yeah, I've put in the first slide as requested on our parameter ensemble. We apply it here for the icon model in limited area mode. And our goal is to quantify uncertainty of the deep convective hailstorm, with the sort of longer term goal to improve prediction of hail. So first of all, to understand which are the sensitive parameters which determine the hail prediction, which is a very uncertain process in numerical weather prediction, and yeah, to get a better handle of which knobs to turn in order to improve its simulation. So therefore, our model is very close to operational configuration, with the exception that we're using a double moment cloud scheme, whereas the operational model has, at least in most members, except for the nowcasting, has a one moment cloud scheme only. So therefore, we run the model in a 2 kilometer horizontal resolution over the so-called icon D2 domain, which is the D for Deutschland, the German domain encompassing Germany and a little bit of Central Europe around Germany. And it has 90 vertical levels. We perturbed 6 parameters, ran over 200 simulations, actually more than we would have needed, but we wanted to cover one part of the parameter range more densely. And the type of parameters, I'll give you the detailed list later, are parameters of the microphysical parameterizations, but also 2 parameters more related to the environment, namely stability and wind shear. Data frequency is actually depending on the output variable. We did some tracking of the storms. For that, we needed 5-minute frequency. For most other analysis, we used a 30-minute frequency. The simulation length is just 1 day. And actually, the analyzed part is, I think, even shorter than a day. The storm happened in the afternoon, and that's what we're looking at. And we used emulation, but that's I think, not the most exciting part here. What is maybe new and different from what other people have done with perturb parameters ensembles is that we looked spatially at the distribution of the precipitation fields and used clustering with principal component analysis to group the simulation output, and that's what I'll show here. So why hail? As I said, hail is very uncertain. It's formed by a long range of microphysical processes which need to be highly parameterized, and all that in deep convective clouds, which are already difficult to predict per se. And what we want to do here is to disentangle these different contributions to uncertainty from the aerosol-related microphysics and from the larger scale environmental parameters. And the paper which already shows up at the bottom is sort of a previous study that we did, that we based this analysis on, or the motivation for the study on, in the paper by Constante Hanse-Wellmann in 2020. We used idealized simulations and similar parameters with the Cosmo model, the precursor of the ICANN model. But now we moved, first of all to ICANN, but then also to a real case simulation, which turned out to be much more complicated than the small domain idealized simulations that we had done before. So to give you an overview of our methods, we started with these model simulations with ICANN. In addition to the 2 moments cloud scheme, we also used an aerosol scheme, but actually we used the aerosol scheme only for the dust, for the ice-nucleating particles. For the CCN, it turned out to be sort of easier and more feasible to just perturb it in a certain range based on a background concentration. We looked at this one selected hail event and the perturb parameter ensemble, as I will describe it. And then the one path of our data analysis goes into the direction of the statistical emulator with the surrogate model based on the Gaussian process emulation. Was splitting the perturb parameter ensemble into training and validation set. And from that we could then with the additional synthetic model output then do a variance-based sensitivity analysis, as has been done in previous studies. The additional part was then the spatial clustering, where we first did the principal component analysis to reduce the dimensionality, and then it came into clustering based on these. This was based on precipitation fields. We also tried it with hail precipitation fields, but I'll show you the results for the total accumulated precipitation. And we had to decide on a physically relevant number of clusters, and for these then we analyzed and are still in the process of analyzing the different sensitivities. And you'll see quite a few plots for these parameter dependencies of the geographical distribution of our precipitation fields. So here's our is the list of the parameters that we perturbed. The upper 4 ones are related to microphysics, the upper 2 ones even to aerosol microphysics and aerosol cloud coupling. So CCN were just scaled by a factor of 2 orders of magnitude, and the reference case was just a background concentration, continental background concentration, whereas the IN where the background concentration was actually a simulated dust concentration. But as we had already seen that the sensitivities were rather low, and there's other sources of IN that we do not take into account where we opted for an even wider range of parameters here. For hail formation, we had seen in earlier studies that the rhyming efficiency is a very important, or can be a very important parameter. And there's actually 2 different rhyming efficiencies for the growth of graupel and that for the growth of hail. And we also varied that over 2 orders of magnitude. And then for stability, what we actually did is to change the slope of the temperature profile in the initial and boundary conditions by adding a spatially constant increment, which varies in altitude such that the boundary layer is always the same. But above the boundary layer, we get then a more or less stable profile. So in essence, we perturb the CAPE, the convectively available potential energy. We decided on having the maximum perturbation at the tropopause here from -2 to +2 Kelvin. That is based on initial condition uncertainty for that case in operational ensembles from IFS. And similar, the value for the wind shear is also based on this. This is a rough estimate of this uncertainty. And for the wind shear, we also had to add an increment to the initial and boundary conditions. And that's what we did here. I think so far for the list of the parameters, and then I'll show you first the overview of our case. So on the left here, you see the observed radar reflectivity of this very nice track of and long track of the actual storm that we are looking at. It was termed Andreas storm, and it left quite a bit of damage here in this area where the cities of Reutling are, for example, and where quite a lot of roofs and cars got damaged by the hail. There were actually more storms in the area, as you can see here in these tracks here. So this is accumulated precipitation over, I think, also over the entire day from radar in this plot here. But this main storm is the one we were interested in. And of course, the icon model does not, out of the box, reproduce the exact same storm at the same location. And we didn't expect that. We were mainly hoping for some other similarly strong cells that we could then investigate. And actually, that's what we got. And here you see the ensemble mean precipitation also accumulated over the entire day for the entire ensemble. And you see also maximum here in the exact area where the real storm happened. But of course, as this is an ensemble mean, it's widened because the cells are all simulated at the same location, and also you can see that on average they are shorter. They don't last as long, and we actually get a second maximum here. That's outside the area of this plot here, but that is actually nothing that happened in reality. So this is actually, or it was not as strong in reality, we should say. There were some showers there, but not that strong convection. So we have, with our 225 simulations, we have these spatial fields, and then we applied the k-means clustering to them to be able to investigate different subgroups of our simulations. And here you can see the 5 clusters of for the total accumulated precipitation, and you see that they actually differ quite a bit. There are some which have this, like this one in particular, has a very pronounced track with high precipitation close to the observed track. Some do have even stronger downstream precipitation here, like cluster 1 and 4, and also cluster 3 here. This has the track more to the north, so less with this right bending of the track, as we expected more for supercell-like storms. So they're actually quite different, and we're still looking at why they are so different. And what's interesting now is that they are also these clusters are also different in terms of how they react to the different parameter perturbations. So first of all, for the overall total precipitation, you see here the dependency on the two thermodynamic factors or environmental factors, the stability scaling, so basically the CAPE and the wind shear scaling. And overall, you see, so actually this, so CAPE increases here to the left, stability increases to the right. The lower the CAPE, the lower the total precipitation as expected, and vice versa. And this actually holds very nicely, and that's a very strong dependency as expected. And this is actually the main dependency we see for total precipitation. Whereas for the wind shear, it's more complicated. I mean, there's also different ways that convective storms can react to wind shear. Wind shear can help the storm development. It can separate the updraft and the downdraft. But if the wind shear becomes too strong, that can actually lead to earlier dissipation of the storm. So we also didn't expect a very clear dependency here, but we actually see a very clear separation of the clusters in terms of the wind shear scaling. So the clusters are marked here with the 5 different colors, and you see that they tend to group together here in this plot of total precipitation versus wind shear scaling. And what is also, now I'll come to back that in a second. First of all, we also did then the emulation and the variance-based sensitivity analysis on these outputs on the total precipitation, as has been done in earlier studies. And yeah, as you can expect from this very strong dependency here, we also find that the stability is clearly the driving factor, has the strongest main effect for the variance of the total precipitation. And actually the wind shear has only a very small contribution. Second most important is CCN, which is not shown here, but I'll show it on a later plot. And then what I wanted to point out is that we already see here that the different clusters, they all tend to have the same direction of the slope for the stability scaling, but they do have different slopes for the wind shear scaling. So the cluster 1, for example, decreases in total precipitation, its wind shear increases, whereas the red cluster here has a weak positive slope here. And yeah, that's something we'll look at again in a second. The second slide of this kind that I brought is for the surface hail. And you might have expected that behaves identical to the total precipitation, but it does not. The plot here on the left has changed. What's shown here is actually now the CCN scaling, not the stability scaling. And as you see in the main effect plot, the CCN is actually now the dominating factor for the surface hail. And that is actually via a reduction of the rhyming rate. As we've seen before, the smaller the droplets get, the less likely they are to rhyme the big ice particles, and the less surface hail we get. And that is actually, again, something which is rather consistent in our clusters, but then we again see that the wind shear scaling separates these clusters. And yeah, so also in terms of the surface hail, the wind shear scaling seems to drive the spatial distribution here. And we've I tried to condense these results for the sake of time. So I'm not going to show you all the plots, but we've summarized them in these in figures like this. We looked at the correlation of the different, here only 4, but we have more output parameters with the different 6 input variables to see whether there's a positive or negative slope in these plots here. And the one I've just shown you, the decrease of the surface hail with the CCN scaling then results in a negative correlation coefficient, which is given here by the blue color in this box here. And this is for the entire ensemble, but now it's interesting to look at this for our different clusters again. And yeah, so you can believe me, I've stared at these for a very long time. What you see from first sight is that they do behave differently, but then the details are the interesting features. So the ones I showed you earlier is the precipitation dependency on stability and wind shear. So for stability, they all are blue, but they are different shades of blue, so different negative slopes, but not the same steepness of the slope. And for the wind shear, as I said, they have different slopes. So some are yellow, so positive correlations, and some are blue, what we've seen earlier. And
Corinna, we're approaching that 20-minute mark.
yeah, I'm at my last slide.
I thought so.
Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to point out here is this very strong, but yeah, not always with the same magnitude, strong positive correlation of hail number with CCN concentration. And what is still ongoing is the analysis of why these differences occur. So we have some theories and also some hints in the results that the storm organization is driven by the wind shears. Their lifetime could also be different, and also for some of them, the cloud base height is actually a factor of importance here. So I'm summarizing here. So we've used our parameter ensemble on the one hand to derive a statistical emulator and quantify the contributions to the main effect, and find, as in previous studies, actually that the CCN is important for hail and stability is overall important for precipitation. But in addition, from our spatial analysis, we found that the wind shear is a controlling factor, and yeah, that drives then the sensitivity also to these microphysical parameters. And with that, I'm done. And I'm very much looking forward to questions and discussion.
Thanks very much, Corinna. So we're a relatively small group here today, so people can feel free to turn their cameras on if they want to. Thanks, Corinna, for a great talk. It seems to me that you learned a lot more from having the clusters than you would have done from your sensitivity analyses alone. But I'm not sure if you've conveyed the idea that you've actually achieved your goal yet, which was to see which of the model parameters controlled the model's ability to represent what actually happened in reality. So I wonder if you've learned anything about structural errors in the model, or about the model's equifinality, the compensating errors, and how they impact that output. Can you tell us a little more about that?
I think you're right that we haven't fully achieved the goal there yet, because I think that with respect to the uncertain parameters, we basically have seen now for this real case what we had seen earlier in the idealized cases, that yeah, CCN are important, and at least if we vary them that widely, they really drive the surface hail. Yeah, that is probably not new enough. But what is really interesting now to see the connection with the cloud dynamics, and that we can in this ensemble with the relatively small variation with wind shears, we can find different sensitivities.
Yeah. I wonder if there was different metrics that you might have been able to use to quantify the causes of uncertainty and the similarity of what each ensemble member produced compared to reality, since that's the goal. If there's maybe some different way of quantifying the discrepancy between the two.
Mm-hmm. And so actually, we on purpose, we decided now not to, I mean, we could, actually in the beginning we quantified the error compared to observations. But we basically, our reference case was a case that was good enough, but we did not try to tune it as much as possible to represent reality, which would have been a different way to approach the problem. And then I think we could have used the observations more.
as you say, it depends on your goal and what your plan is, what you're aiming to learn. Hands up for questions, which is great. So Xian, I saw yours first.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the very interesting talk. Kind of following what Leighton was asking about, I was curious which one of the clusters actually looks most like what happened in reality in terms of the storm shape or development of the storm.
It's this one, the cluster 4, because the storm is also here. It's directly over Reutlingen where it happened, and it's also in terms of at least some of the tracks are similar to the observed track, and also the angle of the track is most similar to reality.
Yeah, thank you. And I was wondering how many of the ensemble members fall into each of the 5 clusters respectively.
Yeah, when preparing the talk, I realized that they don't have the numbers here on the slide, and I don't have them here, but they are not too different. That's what we paid attention to. But I will have to dig them out again.
You can get a sense of it from one of your slides where they're color coded.
Yes,
That
right.
there's similar
Exactly.
proportions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Here you can see that. So cluster 1 is a bit smaller, I think, but yeah, not too different.
I have a
Maybe
few more. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe 4 is bigger, and
Yeah.
there may have been room for more clustering or a larger number of clusters. Sorry, Xian, you're still asking your question.
No, I saw other people have a question, but maybe I just ask one last quick one. I was wondering if you could comment on a little bit on, because this kind of the modeling that you did with this ensemble is 1 day, is in really looking at the kind of forecast time scale. But the icon model, from what I understood, is also being used in sort of longer time scale convective permitting modeling. Could you comment a little bit on how much of this kind of analysis and results might be transferable to a longer time scale, climate time scale simulation versus the weather time scale simulation results in terms of the primary effect?
Yeah, I mean, I think the spatial clustering, yeah, it would be a very different goal to do that on a climatological precipitation field.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could still do it, but it wouldn't be the same. You couldn't get also the same process analysis in terms of the relation between cloud microphysics and cloud dynamics as we do here.
I'm going to go on to David's question. If you want to
Thank
unmute,
you.
David.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Corinna. That was really interesting. I've never seen anything like the wind shear scaling versus the total precip with the clusters. But this might be a naive question. I'm still trying to get my head around the experiment. But is there presumably internal variability? Does that play a role here? I mean, if you perturbed like the starting conditions or something, how do you think that would distribute? Do you think different members of a kind of just perturbing the initial conditions might actually cluster across the 5 different clusters? It's not necessarily the wind shear seems to be playing a role, but I wondered whether there's an interaction with some sort of noise that's kind of determining whether you go in one cluster or not.
I'm not sure I'm really getting the question here, but isn't we didn't do that on purpose, but we picked parameters which apparently had very little effect, like the rubble and hail rhyming efficiencies. Isn't that a perturbation which is now just noise and leads to the spread here within the cluster? So isn't that what he did?
That's true. Yeah. I guess perturbing parameters which don't do much but do maybe a little bit it's effectively the same thing, isn't it? But I'm just wondering whether it might be useful to have a kind of clean reference experiment, which is like several members where you've just literally perturbed something about the initial conditions, just to see whether that stays all within one cluster or whether that that varies across the different clusters. Presumably, looking unless you perturb wind shear, it's kind of suggesting, you know, you could, if you had wind shear that's low, you might stay between clusters. Is it 2 and 3? You know, just I do wonder whether you can occupy more than one cluster with a single set of parameter perturbations, and it might be interesting insight into what's going on. But
yeah, interesting idea. So we have not perturbed initial initial conditions, and of course it would be different, I think, than perturbing the parameters over the entire time. Yeah, but
cool. Thank you.
We've got time for 2 more questions, so let's go to Greg.
Hi, Corinna. Yeah, thanks a lot. This was great. So I actually have two questions. One's just on convection. I was just curious, how come you were not perturbing anything related to stability in the PBL? I guess I was thinking of just, you know, some of the convection analyses that go on these days. There's a lot of discussion on the PBL, you know, and heterogeneity in the PBL. Was there a reason you were avoiding any PBL perturbations?
Yeah, actually, the idea was that we wanted the convection to be triggered. It happens in PBL at the same location, so we didn't want to trigger cells in other places. Of course, that still happened to some extent, as you can see from the clusters, but we tried to avoid that.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So you're trying to do a case. So then, thanks. So then my actually second question was, I really like the idea of clustering, almost as just in general on PPEs as a tool to understand actually success of like emulation. So do you happen to know if your emulator was more biased in one cluster than another? You know, in other words, like I can imagine, like, you know, we're developing emulators of PPEs at the moment. You know, we make scatter plots of our samples, and you know, and there's biases or scatter. But it would be interesting to kind of find a clever way to subset a PPE where you could actually evaluate how good your emulator of the PPE is in certain strategic regions of that PPE space, which could come out in a clustering. So I'm just curious if you would happen to see how good your emulator is when you look at different parts of or different clusters.
I think we have not looked at it, but it would be easy to do that. So yeah, thanks for the idea.
Thanks.
Over to you, Ulrika.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I had a question about, I guess, mostly understanding. I also found it very intriguing that the clustering brings out signals that are not there in the overall sensitivity. And then I thought whether that's similar to if you took out stability and just looked at the other parameters. So if you reduce the dimensionality of your parameter space. And then I realized actually that's sort of what's happening maybe, because when you had this plot with the clusters and how they map onto stability, this is essentially what they do, no? Like one cluster is in a very low stability region and the other is higher. So does that relate to each other? Is what you're doing in effect taking out the most important dimension, and then you have the others left and you give them more opportunity to give a signal? Or how can I understand that?
I think it's not that clear that the stability scaling separates the clusters. If we look at, for example, at cluster 5, that spreads over the entire range of stability. So I think we're not only taking out stability, but it's really a combination of, in particular, stability and wind shear. And actually for wind shear, it's clearer that different wind shear ranges determine the clusters.
So why would you say you get different signals in the different clusters? Or different than the overall signal? Why is that dominated by stability and the others are not?
Can we see that page again, Corinna?
I think I'm lost. Which page?
Maybe the 2D figures with the different clusters, yeah.
Yes, but that doesn't include the overall signal now. That's just the clusters, not the ensemble mean is on this one. I should have put that together. Yeah. I think I'm not sure why. Yeah, I mean, we always try to interpret that in a physical way. We look now at the actual properties of the cluster in terms of storm lifetime and organization and tracks and so on. Yeah, that was not a good answer now, I know, but it's ongoing investigation.
Okay, thanks.
I think that's an interesting point, though, that could help us with our discussion. I'm going to hand over to Xian in a minute. But you're right that those 3 parameters, which don't seem to do much otherwise, are standing out as differences between the clusters, aren't they? So
Yes.
subtleties in terms of variables that you've chosen not to analyze that are otherwise hidden. And I wonder how that applies to the other ways in which we use our PPEs.
Yeah, I should say that we also looked at how much of this correlation is significant, and actually many of these bright colors here, they just turn out to be not significant.
They're very low correlation coefficients. That's
exactly
clear. Yeah. Thanks again, Corinna. That's an excellent summary of Lena's work. So thank you for taking the time to share that with us. Hopefully you'll stay for the rest of our discussion. I'm going to hand over to you, Xian, to lead that discussion and go and check the Etherpad.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks again for the great presentation. So kind of following what we did in previous sessions, just to have a group discussion aligned with the strategic priority from the peer workshop. There are a few different themes, so I thought maybe we could start off by just following what we saw in the presentation just now and have a kind of discussion about both designing PPE experiments and also how to interpret them in terms of using emulators to improve model development. Because I think one of the things that I still didn't really quite get from what you showed the results just now, Corinna, is how kind of this is working towards improving the model performance in terms of better capturing storms, or maybe that's a kind of an ongoing process through further analysis.
Yeah, I think it is, but I mean, one message is that if you want to predict tail, you should get the aerosols and the CCN right, because it strongly depends on this. And yeah, so also what most numerical weather prediction models don't have is prognostic aerosol, but for this process they would need it.
Yeah. Thank you. I wonder if others have any thoughts about kind of using this to work towards model development. Because, sorry.
Sorry, can I just ask to this? I think that's a good point, that this is the way to get model improvements. I was just wondering, in your methods, you also showed this, the range of how you perturb the CCN. And so this will also influence your judgment of how realistic or how detailed CCN will need to be. And this range was quite wide. So do you have any idea how this relates to the range that you would expect the weather models to be wrong in, or if you see what I mean?
Yes, and I mean, yeah, we went one order of magnitude in each direction, and I think that's actually what weather models do is to use always the same value, and that can easily be off by an order of magnitude. So I think it's actually, I think we picked I still would say it's a wide range, but we picked a good range there, I think, for this, to answer this question.
That's the other thing that I thought maybe worth a bit of further discussion is about designing the PP experiment, because I think in your talk you mentioned something that the perturbed parameter range was actually defined through ensemble forecast. I don't think I've seen this type of weather forecast timescale or PPE before, because in previous experiments that at least I've done, determining the range of the perturbed parameters, they're all a bit of sort of expert judgment, and also maybe pushing both the upper and lower bound a little bit. So I was curious to hear a bit more how these were defined through ensemble forecast experiments in the weather forecasting type of experiments.
So that applied only to the wind shear and to the stability. And for that, we looked at the temperature profiles and the wind shear and wind speed in the IFS ensemble. In this case, we actually used the icon ensemble as initial conditions, but we could have used the IFS ensemble. And so that would have determined the driving and boundary conditions for the limited area model anyway, if we had perturbed the initial conditions properly. So we just took inspiration from the actual spread in the IFS model ensemble.
Nathan.
I'm just thinking about the use of clustering and if there's other applications of it in the other sorts of PPEs we use in this community and how it might inform the work we do. But I'm sort of torn between how I might apply it, which might be for aerosol cloud interactions, looking at some process rate parameterizations, like the relative change in liquid water path and cloud drop number concentrations in a stratocumulus field. And you could see how that differs between clusters within a PPE. And maybe that reveals something that's missing in our other analysis. But then in applying that methodology, you might come up against people who say, well, we know what those processes are, so let's use the variables that represent those processes and see what causes the uncertainty in them. So rather than using the clustering, you might get pushed back in a direction that says, let's just use variables that represent known processes that we have a good understanding of. I wonder if there's potential to discuss that. I think Duncan may want to jump in.
Yeah, just I was also trying to think how I really like this clustering, and I was trying to think how we could extend that, and it reminded me of the work that Dave has done using PCA to reduce the dimensionality of observational space, because that's often something that we come across is how do we take all the satellite observations and the various other observations we have and reduce the dimensionality of that to be useful as a constraint, and Dave's done some nice stuff using PCA over that space. And so maybe then you're kind of looking at clusters of observables, so anything that AOD or whatever else we're interested in, cloud fraction or something, and then looking at sensitivity for each of those clusters. It's interesting. Yeah. I just wanted to build on your thought there, but it's yeah, I also find this interesting. I wonder a little bit, having done this clustering, Corinna, whether I think it was the shear relationship. Those sensitivities might have become quite noisy because it looked like the clusters were quite small with respect to shear, and so then maybe you get less of a signal, even though you're able to then do this decomposition. I guess that's a trade-off.
Yes, it actually is, and it was the reason why we added more simulations than we originally had to be able to get better, more robust results for the individual clusters.
David.
Yeah, I'm still reflecting on this clustering. Yes, that's a really good point, that you've increased the ensemble size, and that's really, I think that's part of the reason we're seeing something we've not seen before. It's partly the clustering, but partly the large ensemble size relative to the number of parameters. And what you've done is, having identified kind of wind shear as a kind of driver of the different clusters, I'm thinking of like causal inference kind of theory and stuff like that. They would suggest, looking within the clusters to kind of see what the relationships are, which is what you've done as well, and that large ensemble size helped you to do that. I wondered, what we haven't seen is what defines the clusters. So you said you did it on a kind of PCA, but how many different EOFs did you use, and what did they kind of look like? And what was it, like, really 1 or 2 or 3 EOFs coming out? Because I guess there's some devil in the detail here about what is actually going on.
It was 3, but I don't have the plots here. So yeah, that's actually something I could.
But presumably there's one in the bottom left corner. Then there's probably one that fills up the top right, and then there's a bit, the gap in the middle, which sometimes was filled, and sometimes sort of alternation between the middle upper right and the top right, wasn't it? There was sometimes it extended right up to the corner, and sometimes it didn't. So, but then, yeah, there must be something in the. Have you actually emulated the PCA just to?
That was an
What
idea.
did that show?
That was an idea what we tried, but it didn't really, or at least we didn't get it to work properly.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you didn't see any like wind shear like standing out or anything like that?
I think yes, that
Interesting.
happened, but it's still the validation results were always not good for our attempts. But that was actually an idea that we could sort of boost the clusters by adding output from emulators for the spatial structures, but that has not worked.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I think I'm still struggling. Maybe one of you can explain it, because to me it seems like the sensitivity analysis and the clustering should pick up on the same parameter. If there's one parameter that's important in the sensitivity analysis, it should be the one that's decisive also for the clustering. Otherwise, it means that one of the methods doesn't work so well, no? Or that like in applying one of them, we're doing something wrong. So it might mean that using the whole composite data is the wrong approach and you actually need to cluster? Or where's my thinking mistake in this?
No, I think it can be different because the emulators were applied to the total precipitation, and you can have the same total precipitation but different spatial structures.
Exactly. So that would mean that using the total is a weakness.
It's a different target variable. So if we had picked the precipitation only in a smaller box in the lower left corner or something like that, we probably would have gotten more wind shear.
Exactly. And to me, that's a super important finding, because usually that's what people do. Take the global mean or something like this. And then you would suggest that that's actually an approach that misses much of the subscale variability. And so far, what I've seen was always just showing that the subscale and the global is sort of similar. But then I think this is an important finding that it's not.
Yeah, for this case of the deep convective storm, yes. But depends on what you're interested in.
David.
I get following on from Ulrika's kind of point. It is kind of interesting. That's why I asked about the noise and whether noise was partly behind the reason you get different clusters in different runs. That it's not actually the wind shear seems to be playing a role, but it's not really. I guess with the clustering, you haven't got any ordering, have you? So it's not like PCA. If we did look at it in PCA space, you might see there's a bit of ordering going on, but it might be that there's just something internally generating storms that some rain in two different parts, some just rain in the bottom left corner, and then the parameters, presumably it's over different terrain and stuff like that, the different parameters can be behaving in a different way in different parts of that space, that whole the spatial area that you're looking at. And sometimes you're just picking up on the parameters that just concentrate in the bottom left hand corner, and then sometimes it depends where the rain is. I mean, I can really see the value of I think Ulrika's made a good point. The global analysis is could be making a mistake, just because it would have missed that subtlety. Whereas you can imagine individual kind of analyses within the clusters, actually doing the emulation and looking at the sensitivity within the clusters like you've done, the percentage variance might be the right way to go about it. Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So just to follow up on what David just said, so basically because in the global analysis, all the parameters are, in this as well, all the parameters are prescribed to be the same value over different terrains, whereas this clustering analysis probably is telling us that the parameter should have been using different values over different terrains. And that's what was being picked up by the clustering analysis. Is that the way to interpret this?
I wouldn't say they should have had different values over the different terrains, but simply the sensitivity is different.
Yeah.
I'm saying that the ranges should have been different.
Yeah, I guess the values could have been different over different. Say if the rain is developing over different parts of the domain that you're modeling.
But how would you determine then the parameters there?
That's a good question.
Yeah, you would also need a spatial structure,
Yeah.
perturbations and stability, wind shear and aerosols. I mean, we know that that's of course happening in reality.
Yeah. I'm conscious of the time. So before we come to the full hour, I was wondering if anybody has any thoughts on the potential of using the clustering in combination with the emulator to reduce parameter space, or identify kind of structural errors in the model. I guess to me that somewhat depends on the target as well. Say, for example, if the target is to identify parameter space that captures the development of the shape of the storm as same as reality, then we could then identify a certain cluster through the cluster analysis and identify the parameter values within that particular cluster, and then reduce the parameter space outside of that. I don't know if I'm making sense anymore. Gregory. You have your hand up, Gregory.
Yep. Xian, yeah. Hey, this is awesome. This is an awesome question. I'd be curious, especially the structural error part. It's not. I'd be curious to hear any comments on that. It's not fully evident at the moment how I would use clustering to assess structural error. I mean, I know, like, I think of like the emulator, and I know, if I'm like looking at all the outputs and I'm looking at the whole PPE and I'm emulating the whole PPE, I look at the whole swath of outputs, and then I know where observations fall or something, and I can tell if I, can never hit that target based on my cloud of output points. But I'm having a hard time figuring out how the clustering, because clusters would then be subparts or subsamples of that whole cloud of points. I'm curious to know, though, if someone else has comments on that. I think it's a really neat thought.
I think what Duncan said in the beginning might be something to compare this to observations, no? If you can match your parameters with parameters you can have in observations, it would be nice to see whether you get the same clusters.
You mean outputs and observations, or I think, what do you mean by parameters? You mean like outputs?
Well, both input. Well, parameters would be the input and the variables also output. And if you could get both of them to match between your model and observations, then the clustering might be a really nice way, as Duncan said, to deal with the huge amount of data and get a nice comparison. But I'm not sure that's what he was alluding to.
Yeah, I guess to the extent that a parameter is observable. I mean, a lot of these model parameters are sort of our constructions, or CCN, I guess, would be observable, but maybe like some sort of auto conversion thing, not that was necessarily talked about here, wouldn't be. So yeah, I guess it depends on your parameter selection.
I think maybe Dave will build on this, but what I had in mind rather was, so I mean the parameters are deliberately orthogonal. There's no correlation in parameter space because of the way we designed the sampling, which I assume was similar in Corinne's ensemble. But rather, if you do PCA over that ensemble space, over that design, then you can pull out which aspect, or which locations for a given output have highest variance across the ensemble. And then you can use those as they kind of give you better constraints because they have the highest variance. So you pull out the modes of variability in AOD or SST or whatever it is you're interested in doing, such that you maximize the variance and makes it somehow easier for the emulator to train, and hopefully gives you a stronger constraint as well.
David?
Yeah, that what Duncan's just said sounds like Salwell's kind of work. What I was going to say was actually something different, which was on the. Oh, sorry, I've got an alarm. Something I was going to say. I wonder if there's a difference. This experiment is set up on like forecast error, so I wonder in a lot of us who have done PPEs probably doing it on like climate models where there's a lot of we're not actually. The initial conditions don't really matter after a while. I mean, sure, they generate noise, but we're not worried about it. Whereas this specifically is about a specific, like hail thing. So the suggestion, I think was it you, C. Hunter, which was suggesting actually just focusing on cluster 4, because actually that was the one that produced the realistic kind of set of members. The clustering has been used to kind of identify which cluster the observations would kind of sit in. That's kind of subsetted the ensemble, and then looking at the parameters within that makes some sense to me, to actually saying these are the parameters you wanted for that particular hailstorm. And so the clustering has been used to filter, if you like, the parameter space. So I kind of agree with that. I think I have seen this somewhere before, like Gregory. I have seen this but a much poorer sense, in the sense that some models really in parameter space can actually do like horrible things, and you can filter them out. Like they might crash, they might produce instabilities, they might do terrible things like destroy all the forests or something like that. But that's a poor man's cluster of something that Corinna's done, something much more sophisticated and got some much more interesting clusters. But in those cases, we wouldn't use the global analysis. We would have got rid of the rubbish, and then we would have focused in. So I kind of see analogies with that. I do wonder if there's like a machine. It all feels like machine learning kind of. You've got classification, and then you've got building interaction between parameters as well. So
Yeah.
I don't think we've ever. Has anyone? I mean, Greg, you've done this machine learning on emulators, and I've always used Gaussian processes and regression, but I'm sure there's more sophisticated ways of capturing all this sort of stuff. Now I'm rambling.
Yes. Thank you, David. Leighton.
Yeah, I was coming to say exactly the same point, that there'd be some caution with zooming in too much on a cluster within a climate model environment, because there's likely some structural errors in that model that are going to cause you to focus in on the wrong part of parameter space for your next model version. Whereas here, the idea with a weather prediction model is being able to zoom in on exactly how the model can perform as well as possible for that scenario. So it's a very different perspective to be taking, and a different approach. But I'm sure there's wider applications for using clustering than just going through that zooming in on the best model variant sort of perspective. I really like that it's revealed aspects that were missing based on the variables you chose to analyze. And I wonder how much we overlook just based on our sensitivity analyses. Simple point.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm aware of the time, and I think this has been great discussion points, and thank you all for contributing. And thanks again, Corinna, for that very, very interesting presentation. I haven't really seen PPE done on weather forecasting timescale models, so it's great to see kind of different experiments done in different modeling settings. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks a lot for having me. That's great.
Yeah.
I just would say, Sian, that we did have an hour and a half for this
Oh,
session, but
sorry.
I agree that it's a natural endpoint because there's such a small group here, and I think people have all had a fair chance to have their say. Does anyone have anything they want to add before we finish?
No.
I
Thanks,
think we're
Corinna.
good. Yeah, thanks, Corinna. And
Good.
thanks everyone for coming and joining us.
Yeah.
It's nice to have these events ongoing. We have more plans. There's a couple of speakers who we have in mind. And if you know anyone you'd like to volunteer, you're welcome to use our website to refer them. By all means, feel free to nominate someone or volunteer yourself. Yeah.
Leighton.
All right. Yes, David.
Leighton, when's the recording available for this? Because I was kind of sitting there listening to Corinna going, oh my God, there's loads of people who don't normally come along to these who would love to hear about this. So all the people in your neck of the woods, like foundation science, and
Yeah, exactly right.
they would love it.
Likely within the week, and certainly on our website.
Brilliant.
It's where we store them. Yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
Excellent.
All right.
Thanks.
I started it on time, David. So I got everything.
You're a star.
Very good.
All right.
you.
Thank you,
Great.
Corinna.
Thank you
Have a
all.
great evening.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
Corinna. That was brilliant.
Oh, sorry, I misremember the time.